Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. Today's video we are going to have a look at the camera that many people have been talking about since it was announced, and it is a camera that is really hard to buy right now because of the high demand. It is the latest flagship camera from Nikon and also the company's first ever flagship mirrorless camera. It is the Nikon Z9. It is a pretty hard camera to review because there are so many things that I can talk about and show you in this review. So instead of going through every single feature that would probably make it a 2 or 3 hour long video, I will focus on some of the most important features or changes. I would like to say a big thank you to all of you who have commented on my posts here on YouTube and tell me what you want me to test and talk about in this review. I'm sorry I'm not able to test and include everything that you guys want me to test, but if there is something that you want to know and I didn't talk about in this video, please just drop a comment below and I will try to answer your questions directly. Okay, so let's get started. First thing I want to talk about is the body design first. This is the first flagship mirrorless camera from Nikon, and in a lot of ways, this camera closely resembles what a flagship Nikon DSLR camera look and feel like. It has an integrated, fully featured vertical grip, and the body is really quite big and heavy, just like a flagship Nikon DSLR. I know some of you may wonder why Nikon doesn't make this camera smaller and lighter, and to be honest, I want a slightly smaller camera too, but this camera wasn't really designed for me. It was designed for people like sports photographer who is currently using a D5 or D6 who either really get used to or really need this kind of big camera body. For example, if they are shooting with some big heavy lenses. There are also other reasons like avoid overheating, especially when recording 8K video, as quite a few cameras in the market suffer from overheating when recording video. I will talk about overheating very soon as well, as I have some results that I want to share with you guys. In some of my previous videos, I have mentioned the Z6 and Z7 body was definitely not a pro or even semi-pro Nikon full-frame camera design, as there are a few things that really shows that. For example, the Z6 or Z7 doesn't have that multi-button down thingy on the top left of the camera, and the viewfinder is a rectangular shaped one instead of the circular one, and also there's no shortcut button combo to format the memory card. Now with the Z9, all these things are back to show you this is a real professional flagship camera from Nikon. I want to talk about the build quality next, but before that I really want to mention one other thing first. The first time I picked up this camera, I was really surprised. Unlike some other mirrorless camera, you have to wait a second or two before you can start shooting when you power on the camera. With the Z9, you can start shooting pretty much straight away when you turn on the camera. And also, everything responds instantly. If you go into the menu system, go through the different settings, using the touch interface, everything is just so smooth and so quick. I have never used any other mirrorless camera or even DSLR camera that is so responsive. And even the shutter shield, which is an optional feature that you can choose to enable or disable, which is a curtain that would come down and protect the sensor as soon as you turn off the camera, so your sensor won't get dust on it while you are changing lens. The shutter shield would come down pretty much instantly when you turn off the camera. Some other cameras have a similar feature, but you need to wait a bit of time when you turn off the camera. So all these things together just make the shooting experience with this Nikon Z9 really enjoyable. And in terms of build quality, it is an extremely solid camera. I've used a few cameras that also has a really solid build quality. For example, the Sony A1 or the Panasonic S1 series, they are also very solid camera, but just not quite as solid as this Nikon Z9. The overall layout and design of this camera is very similar to Nikon's previous flagship cameras. There are lots of buttons on the top, at the back and the front of the camera. All the important buttons on the back and top of the camera can be light up, so no problem if you are shooting in really dark area. There's a status screen at the top. All the connection ports are on the left side of the camera, and we have the dual CF Express card slots on the right side. I do find this door for the memory card is a bit hard to open, but other than that, everything is pretty much perfect. But the button layout is not exactly identical to the D6. The most obvious changes is that with the D6, like other Nikon DSLR cameras, there usually are 5 buttons on the leftmost of the camera at the back here, but they are now moved to the right because the screen on the Z9 is no longer a fixed one. The screen on the Z9 has a multi-axis tiltable design, so you can tilt it left, right, up, down, or even tilting in both axes together. The tilting mechanism seems to be pretty tough. I don't think people will have problem or reliability issues with it. My only minor complaint about this tiltable screen is that when I tilt the screen down, I can only tilt it by up to 45 degrees. I would like to be able to tilt it down all the way up to 90 degrees. But overall, it's definitely great to see Nikon move away from a fixed screen design for their flagship camera. And when you rotate the camera, the LCD screen would also respond by moving and rotating the information to match the camera's orientation. This is great for people who shoot in portrait orientation a lot. While this is not the first camera that has this kind of feature, Nikon's implementation seems to feel and look very natural. But even though a few buttons and controls position have changed on this Z9, if you are a D5 or D6 user, picking up this camera and you will feel right at home very quickly. One big difference between the previous flagship and this camera is that this is a mirrorless camera and it has an electronic viewfinder instead of the optical viewfinder. The electronic viewfinder is a 3.6 million dot one with 100% frame coverage and 0.8 times magnification. Looking at the specs, it seems to be identical to the electronic viewfinder on the Nikon Z6, Z7 and Mark II. And when I first put the camera up here and looked through it my eyes, I was a little bit disappointed too, because I was expecting a larger and higher resolution electronic viewfinder. There are some other higher resolution electronic viewfinder in the market already. However, just after using the Z9 for a little while, I quickly realized there is something really nice about the electronic viewfinder on the Z9, which make it arguably the best electronic viewfinder experience I ever had. First thing, usually if you set the electronic viewfinder to auto switching between LCD and electronic viewfinder, when you pick up the camera and put it in front of your eye, it would usually take about half a second or so for the camera to switch from LCD to the electronic viewfinder. It is a small delay, but it is still noticeable. For people like me who have been shooting with mirrorless cameras for years, we kind of get used to it, but you would definitely need to wait a bit of time before you can see the world through the electronic viewfinder every time you pick up the camera. If you are shooting something that is not time critical, it doesn't really matter. But if you shoot sports or events, or like me shoot weddings, that slight delay may mean we have missed some really important moment. And for users who still mainly shoot with DSLR camera, this is one big thing that makes you love the optical viewfinder on the DSLR more. But with the Z9, the electronic viewfinder would switch on and start working pretty much instantaneously when you put the camera in front of your face. There is virtually no delay. And while the 3.6 million dot resolution of the electronic viewfinder isn't super high, somehow Nikon managed to make the viewfinder image looks very nice. It just looks very natural. It's sharp but not over sharpened or digital like. Unfortunately, it's not something that I can easily show you in this review, and this almost made me forgot I'm shooting with a mirrorless camera until I noticed the additional overlay information which the optical viewfinder doesn't have. And that gets to my next point. With the mirrorless cameras, one of the biggest advantage, in my opinion, is that the electronic viewfinder can display the actual exposure, actual colors that you are going to capture. So if you are underexposing the photo, for example, then you can visualize it in real time through the electronic viewfinder, and you change the exposure. You can also see the effect, the changes immediately as well. This doesn't only make it easier for you to nail the exposure and get the correct white balance, it does also help you to be more creative with your photo, as you can change the settings and immediately see the results. So if you want to experiment with different settings, you can see and preview the results instantly. Another great thing about the electronic viewfinder is that you can also overlay a lot of different information on top of the image. You can see the histogram, peaking, virtual horizon, and many other information through the electronic viewfinder, and I think that is absolutely fantastic. However, if you have been a long time DSLR shooter, all this extra information can be overwhelming, looks completely unnecessary to you. Because of that, Nikon allows you to customize what you can see from the electronic viewfinder. You can turn off pretty much all the information overlay on the electronic viewfinder. With the minimal setting, what you can see is only the autofocus point. That is until you half click the shutter, then you can also see the shutter speed, aperture, and the ISO. So you get a really clean viewfinder image with no distraction. It really reminds me of the old film SLR camera like my Nikon F2. You can switch the view mode to what Nikon called adjust for easy of viewing, which means the brightness color in the viewfinder is not really affected by the camera settings. What you see is really similar to an optical viewfinder. Of course, it means you lose the advantage of being able to preview the exposure and colors, but if you have been shooting with DSLR for decades, this may be more familiar with you and something that you are more comfortable with. So yeah, you can customize the electronic viewfinder on the Z9 in so many ways. So no matter you want to display as much information as possible to assist your shooting, or you want it to look like a good old optical viewfinder because you are a long-time DSLR shooter and you want to keep the things the same way, you can make it to exactly what you want. Now let's talk about no blackout. If you are shooting with a DSLR camera, every time you take a photo, the mirror has to move up to allow the sensor to capture the image. So you get a very short period of time that you see nothing through the optical viewfinder. It is a very short amount of time, especially on a professional DSLR like the Nikon Z. But if you are shooting in burst mode and trying to follow a fast moving object, the blackout would make it a bit harder to track your subject accurately. Mirrorless cameras, they don't have a mirror of course, but most mirrorless cameras still has blackout because when the camera is taking photo, the image processing pipeline would temporarily not feed any update image to the electronic viewfinder. So the electronic viewfinder receives no new image to display, and that's why we also have blackout on mirrorless camera. There are a few mirrorless cameras that offer you no blackout shooting, but what they really do is when you are taking photos, the viewfinder just display or repeat the last image during that time, so you don't see blackout. It is an improvement, but it's still not really the perfect solution as you are still just seeing the previous image, not the latest image. With the Z9, Nikon has completely fixed or remove this limitation by their new dual stream technology. So basically, the camera sensor is feeding its signal into two different picture streams. One stream is for the camera to record the photo, and the other stream is for the electronic viewfinder display, and these two streams are independent from each other. So when you are taking photo, the stream that updates the electronic viewfinder is still working continuously, and that means when you looking through the electronic viewfinder, you still get a perfect continuous video feed with no blackout and no repeated frames. And the result is, to me, really the best ever electronic viewfinder, or pretty much any kind of viewfinder shooting experience ever, especially when you are shooting action photos. Okay, now let's talk about the image sensor. The Nikon Z9 has a 46 megapixel sensor with base ISO 64 up to maximum ISO 102,400. This is very different to Nikon's previous approach, as while Nikon did have some high resolution flagship camera, they were all the X model, and the main model would be much lower resolution and quite often even lower resolution than their consumer cameras. And there were two main reasons for that. One is to allow higher burst rate, as the higher resolution photo requires much bigger buffer, and also the write speed has to be faster to keep up. And the other reason is better low light performance. So now Z9 has more than double the resolution of the D6, a huge jump from 20 megapixel to 46 megapixel. So how does it affect the camera? Well, in terms of the burst rate or burst speed, it doesn't really matter that much. In fact, the maximum burst speed of the Z9 has gone up by almost 50% from 14 frames per second to 20 frames per second. So that is with autofocus and everything, so that is great. Buffer size wise, it is a bit tricky to compare because the Z9 can output in either the lossless compressed RAW, and there is also two new RAW formats which are called high efficient RAW. Basically, these are lossy compressed RAW formats which should have some kind of drop in image quality, but in return the file size is a lot smaller, and that would also increase the buffer size. And another thing is, the speed of the memory card also would dramatically changes the buffer size, as if the camera can quickly write the photos to the card, you can just take photo for much longer. So I did a bit of test with two different type of memory cards. One is a Sony XQD card, which I bought when I bought my Z6, and also a Pergear CF Express card, which I'm working on the review at the moment as well. When shooting JPEG at 20 frames per second, with the Sony XQD card, I get around 80 photos before the shooting speed starting to slow down, and switch to the Pergear 1TB CF Express card, I can get around 240 JPEG before the shooting speed starting to slow down. So that is a 3 times improvement in buffer size. And when shooting in the lossless RAW format, I get around 40 photos with the Pergear CF Express card, but as I change to the high efficient RAW format, I can get to over 130 RAW file even when I'm still shooting at 20 frames per second. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is the Pergear CF Express cards that I use in this test are more like a budget high capacity card. So while its write speed is really good for its price, it is nowhere as fast as the fastest cards in the market. Using a faster card would further improve the buffer size, and I saw some really impressive results from people using the fastest cards in the market. And shooting in the new high efficient RAW format would definitely give you much bigger buffer size compared to the lossless RAW. But isn't the high efficient RAW format lossy? How much does it affect the image quality? So there are two types of high efficient RAW that you can choose with the Nikon Z9. One is the high efficient RAW Star and one is the high efficient RAW. According to Nikon, the high efficient RAW Star is nearly identical to the lossless RAW format, while the high efficient RAW without the star in the end would be slightly lower quality, but the file size is a lot smaller. And from my test, I definitely agree with Nikon that the high efficient RAW Star is nearly identical to the lossless RAW format. I shot a lot of comparison photos, and even when I review them side by side, zooming to 400% and also try to push and pull the file and compare the results, I really don't see any difference at all between the high efficient RAW Star RAW and the lossless RAW photo. And I would say even the smaller high efficient RAW files, I'm struggling to see the difference when I compare it to the lossless RAW. Once again, even when I zoom into the photo 400% and push and pull exposure, I don't really see any big difference. There may be a tiny bit of difference, but I tell you what, the difference is so small that it probably doesn't really matter for most kind of usage. However, choosing one of these new high efficient RAW formats not only make your buffer size bigger, but there's also a huge reduction in the image file size. Here is a set of test photos that I shot with the same camera settings. The JPEG file is 21.7 megabyte. The lossless compressed RAW is 52.8 megabyte, which means for 1 gigabyte of memory card, you get about 20 photos. The high efficient Star, the file size is 33.3 megabyte, which is about 40% smaller in size. And the high efficient without the Star, the file size is only 21.9 megabyte, which is like 60% smaller in size. So the high efficient RAW file is almost identical to the JPEG file, but it gives you a lot more flexibility in post-processing. Interestingly, when I shot the same photo with the 24 megapixel Z6, the lossless compressed RAW from the Z6 is 31 megabyte, which is pretty much the same size as the high efficient Star RAW from the Z9, despite the Z9 has double the resolution. I'm not a big fan of the lossy RAW output, but with the Z9, I actually switched to shooting with the high efficient RAW Star format once I realized there is really not any noticeable drop in image quality, but I have all the benefits. And if I'm shooting sports or anything that I need to keep shooting in burst mode, I would shoot in high efficient RAW format myself. Okay, so what about the high ISO performance? Let's have a look at the RAW file from the Z9, which are directly converted to JPEG with no post-processing, no noise reduction applied at all. Up to ISO 3200, the RAW output is still really clean, noise is kept at a very low level, contrast colors are still really good. ISO 6400, we're starting to see a bit more noise, but otherwise the image quality is still great. ISO 12800, there is a bit more noise again, but if I don't do pixel peeping, I still don't really see any difference. ISO 25600, I can start seeing a bit of noise even without zooming the photo. And at ISO 51200, contrast drops quite a bit, and when you zoom in the photo, you will see a lot of noise. At the maximum ISO 102,400, the image quality become pretty bad now. But to be honest, if I'm shooting weddings or events under very low light condition, I was still happy to shoot at ISO 102,400 if I need a fast shutter speed. And if I do a bit of post-processing, apply some noise reduction, the picture is still pretty usable. I do not have a Nikon D6 with me to do some high ISO comparison, but I have done a bit of comparison with the 24 megapixel Nikon Z6, which is quite a low resolution camera, and it has really good high ISO performance. And since the Z9 is much higher resolution, I have resampled the Z9 photo to 24 megapixels, so it is equalized to the output from Z6. From base ISO up to ISO 25600, there really isn't much difference at all. Color, contrast, amount of noise are very similar even when you compare them side by side. At ISO 51200, they're starting to have some noticeable difference. The Z6 maintains better contrast and the shadow area is a bit cleaner than the output from the Z9. And the difference becomes bigger when we go up to ISO 102,400. Again, the Z6 has better contrast, better color and cleaner image. The Z6 can go up one more stop to ISO 204,800 while Z9's maximum ISO is 102,400. So looking at these photos, at the low to mid ISO, there is not much difference. At the very high ISO, the Z6 has approximately one stop advantage compared to the Z9. This is a trade-off you got with the high resolution 46 megapixel sensor. But on the flip side, since the base ISO of the Z9 is only ISO 64, and the shutter speed can go up to 1/32,000 second. So that allows you to take photo with a really fast lens on bright sunny day without having to use any ND filter. This is a photo I shot with the Laowa Argus 45mm f/0.95 lens at f/0.95. So because of the high shutter speed and also the low ISO, I can shoot this photo without using any ND filter. To see how the raw file from the Z9 would look like if I do some extreme post-processing, I shot a set of test photos. This is the first photo that I shot that is normally exposed at ISO 64. And then this is the photo that I've underexposed by 6 stops. Then I bring the photo into Lightroom and I push the exposure by 6 stops in post-processing. This is the result. I think it still looks pretty decent. There's a small amount of color shift, but I think very acceptable as I only push the exposure by 6 stops and I haven't done any other post-processing. I didn't even adjust the white balance, so it looks pretty nice. And the contrast also looks pretty decent. And let's do a quick comparison with the Z6 again. Here is the Z6 raw file shot at the base ISO and also underexposed by 6 stops, and then I push 6 stops in post-processing. The amount of shadow details that I can recover, the overall contrast is really quite similar. I honestly can't say which camera is better. However, I do notice the result from the Z6 has some more obvious color shift. There is some pretty noticeable magenta color cast, while the result from the Z9 has more correct colors. And here is another test. Instead of underexposing the photo, this time the photo is quite a bit overexposed. At least the area that is outside the window. So pretty much everything outside the window is completely blown out. And then I try to recover the highlight and this is what I got. I think the result is not bad as I recover quite a bit of highlight details that was completely blown out before. And if I compare it with the Z6 photo that both were shot at the base ISO and with equivalent exposure setting, the result is pretty similar. And it seems the Z9 actually can recover a tiny bit more highlight than the Z6. Compared to the previous Nikon Z cameras, the Z9 comes with some major upgrade when it comes to autofocus. There are a few more autofocus modes that you can select, including the 3D tracking mode, which a lot of Nikon users really want to see it come back to the Nikon mirrorless camera, and now we finally have it. But I think the most important thing is whether the autofocus works and does it work really well or not. So I went to the Gannet colony here in Auckland to shoot some bird in flight photo to test out the Z9's autofocus performance. I arrived there quite late in the afternoon, almost 7 PM, so it was only an hour or so before sunset. If you live in Auckland, you will know that is the perfect place to capture the sunset, as it is the west side of the Auckland facing the Tasman Sea, and the sun would go down to the ocean right in front of you. However, it does make it tricky to shoot birds in the afternoon, as most of the time the bird would be strongly backlit, so it can be really challenging to the camera. But still, the autofocus on the Z9 works really well when I'm trying to track and shoot photos of the birds that is flying around. First thing I want to say is, I was surprised the camera not just able to detect if there is a bird, but it can even detect the head or even the eye of the bird sometimes. Now, the bird head and eye detection is mainly for birds that are not flying around. So if the bird is flying, then it will only detect the whole bird, and it does a pretty good job. Quite often when the bird enters the autofocus detection area, then you can see the camera can detect it and follow it pretty accurately and quickly. But I'm not saying the bird detection is perfect, as there are times that it doesn't detect the bird even though I thought it should be able to. But on the other hand, even when the camera cannot detect the bird inside the frame, as long as you are using an appropriate autofocus mode, the camera can still follow the bird movement very accurately. And remember, I mentioned about the viewfinder has no blackout using the dual stream technology. It really made a huge difference when I was shooting these bird photos. I'm not a bird photographer at all, and I've never managed to follow the bird movement very well and precisely with all the other cameras that I've used in the past. Even using a D5 or D500, I have the same issue. But this time with the Z9, I found I can certainly follow the movement of the birds really well, and that makes my success rate even higher. There's no blackout at all when I'm taking photos even in burst mode, and I only see some indicator flashing on the side of the electronic viewfinder to remind me that I'm taking photos. The Nikon Z9 is easily the best camera I've ever used to track fast moving objects. By the way, since I only had the new Nikon Z 24-120 lens with me on that day, which is not really a very long lens, so for some of the photos I switched to DX mode to get better reach, and I still get around 20 megapixel resolution after the DX cropping. A huge breakthrough with the Nikon Z9 is that it has no mechanical shutter at all. Yes, it only has an electronic shutter. The Z9 is not the first camera that has no mechanical shutter. Recently, we have the Sigma FP and FPL that also has no mechanical shutter. But those cameras were not really designed for shooting action photos. They have really severe rolling shutter issue if you take photo when the camera is panning, even if you are just panning quite slowly. This is because we still don't have the global shutter sensor for this kind of camera, so the image sensor's slow readout speed would result in the rolling shutter effect. So this is really a big surprise that Nikon launched a flagship camera for sports photographer that doesn't have a shutter. The most similar cameras like the Sony A1 or the Canon R3, they all still have a mechanical shutter. But does it work? Do we have any noticeable rolling shutter effect? Of course, I did a test. I mounted the Z9 on a rig with a Z6 as well, so I can do some comparison with both camera panning at the same speed. The Z6 was shooting with the electronic shutter as well. So look at the results side by side. You can easily see the Z9 has really small amount of rolling shutter even when I pan the camera pretty quickly. The same kind of panning would completely distort the output from the Z6, while the Z9 is just much better. So is it completely no rolling shutter? No, it's not. But I think when you are taking real-world photos, it's really unlikely you will see any noticeable rolling shutter effect in your photo. The Z9 has a 5-axis in-body image stabilizer that, according to Nikon, offers up to 6 EV shutter speed compensation. I haven't tested the IBIS performance for taking photos, but I did test the IBIS performance for shooting video. Here is a side-by-side comparison video that I shot using 2 cameras mounted on a bracket. The left one is a Z6 with the image stabilizer disabled, and the right one is the Z9 with the stabilization turned on. Focal length is 50mm, so it's not a really wide angle, and I was walking in a very normal way, so I didn't try to do any ninja walking, as I want to see how the footage would look like under more demanding situation. And as you can see, without any stabilization, the footage is really bumpy, and the Z9 does a reasonably good job in stabilizing the footage. And here is another comparison also with the Z6, and both cameras shooting at 50mm focal length, but this time both camera has the IBIS turned on and I was walking normally. I think you can see the Z9 stabilized the video footage quite a bit smoother than the Z6. It is still not gimbal like smooth, and the video footage would still jumps a little bit, but for 50mm focal length and normal walking, I think it is not too bad at all. The Nikon Z9 has some really serious video filming capability. If I want to talk about all the features and show you all my test results, I can easily make it a 1 hour plus video. So I will only talk about a few major things in this video. Firstly, it can record 4K and 8K video internally and externally, of course. 4K video, it can capture up to 120 frames per second. And for 8K video, right now, it can capture up to 30 frames per second at up to 10 bit. But with future firmware update, it can do 8K 60 and even 12-bit RAW video, and also 4K ProRes RAW video. So this is pretty amazing and easily the best camera in the market at this price range. But one thing we learned from some other mirrorless cameras that can also shoot 8K video is it could overheat when shooting 8K video. Or would it? The only way to find out is to test it out myself. I set up the Z9 to record 8K 30 10-bit video using a per gear 1TB CF Express card that I mentioned before, and see whether the camera would overheat or not. And if it does, how long would it take to overheat it? It is summer right now here in New Zealand, so not super hot, but the day I did the test, the temperature was around 23 degrees Celsius. So yeah, a little bit warm. I did charge up the battery completely the night before, but then I did quite a bit of testing that morning. So by the time that I start the test in the afternoon, the battery indicator was already 1 bar less than full. And in the end, I managed to record almost 2 hours of 8K 30 10-bit video footage before the camera shut down. And that was just because the battery went flat, which is not bad at all considering the battery was not fully charged when I started. And the camera was only a little bit warm, and yeah, warm, not hot at all. And when I checked the memory card and the battery, and they were also just a bit warm. I remember when I test some other camera that's shooting 8K, after 30 minutes or less than that probably, the camera was really hot already, and the card was hot and the battery was hot. So no such issue at all with this Nikon Z9. Unfortunately, I do not have another battery to restart the recording straight away, but since the camera is only a little bit warm, I believe if I continue the recording, I wouldn't have any issue and probably can record for quite a long time without any overheating issue. By the way, the almost 2 hour long 8K 30 10-bit file from the Z9 is just a bit over 350GB file size. After testing the Z9 for about 2 weeks, I was honestly really impressed by it. I guess what most people talk about is how good the autofocus performance is, the 20 frames per second burst speed, or the 8K video recording. But you know what? Yes, these are all amazing, The autofocus works really well. 8K video recording for 2 hours with no overheating is also great. But these are not what I'm most impressed about the Z9. What I'm most impressed is that the Z9 feels exactly like a DSLR, and not just a typical DSLR. It feels like a flagship DSLR like a Nikon D5 or D6. It is a weird feeling because Z9 is a mirrorless camera, which is very different to a DSLR in a lot of ways. But when I picked up the Z9 and took the first photo, I forgot I was shooting with a mirrorless camera. I have shot with a lot of really great mirrorless cameras. Some of those cameras may be technically better overall than a DSLR, but they feel more like an alternative option, not a replacement. Because there are just a few things that is really great about the DSLR that is missing on those other cameras. But when shooting with a Z9, it really feels like a DSLR. There isn't a single thing that made me say that. I think it is a lot of things that added together. For example, how fast the camera starts up and ready to use when you switch it on, and how fast it switches from the LCD to electronic viewfinder when I put the camera in front of my face. You virtually don't even notice the electronic viewfinder was off before. The image I see through the electronic viewfinder that looks almost like an optical viewfinder, and actually better than the optical viewfinder because there is no blackout when you are shooting in burst mode. And that really solid flagship DSLR build construction. The downside of the Z9 compared to a D6, there really isn't that much. Yes, the EVF still has a bit of lag, but it is very minor, and in my opinion, things like that no blackout dual stream technology can easily offset any kind of latency. The other downside is the battery life. A mirrorless camera always needs to power its EVF or LCD when the camera is turned on, so the battery life is never going to be exactly as good as a DSLR. But if you ask me, I would say the battery life of the Z9 is actually pretty decent. A full day of shooting is quite possible with just a single battery. The Nikon Z9 is not just a flagship level mirrorless camera. It is a camera that can replace any flagship level DSLR, and it does a better job in a lot of areas.